Darkness draws near, but the character of Jesus is changeless. On the night before his crucifixion, in the stillness of Gethsemane, Jesus falls with his face to the ground and begins to pray. Facing the dreadful prospect before him, he pleads with God 3 times, saying, "Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me." And so heavy was his anguish that as he prayed, sweat mixed with blood withdrew from his skin. The reality of death on a cross was now very true, and his soul knew great sadness. But the hour could not pass from him. Waiting in solitude and sorrow, the cup that had to be drunk now touched his lips. Darkness had thrown its first shadow. In Matthew's Gospel, we read of this remarkable conversation between Jesus and his betrayer, Judas. Judas arrives at Gethsemane leading a large crowd sent from the chief priests to bring Jesus under arrest. And when he sees Jesus, he walks over to him and he says, "Greetings, teacher." And he kisses him as a sign to the crowd behind that this is the man to be arrested. And Jesus responds with this, "Friend, do what you came to do." Friend. There's something deeply moving about his words. Just moments ago, Jesus was troubled, filled with sorrow, and his soul was consumed with anguish so terrible that it began to taste death. And now all of a sudden, he stood before this great mass of bodies armed with clubs and swords, a multitude with intentions for malice. This is the very instance that sets in motion his crucifixion. And yet Jesus, with love born of heaven, locks eyes with his betrayer and calls him his friend. What kindness he extends, and with such calmness. The most gruesome hardships lay ahead. After this, he's arrested, abandoned by friends, victim of a trial void of justice, beaten and flogged, ridiculed and mocked, and crucified. But even the gravest adversities couldn't lessen the intimacy Jesus held for those he knew. And though his soul tormented, there's no anxiety in his response to Judas as that treacherous kiss left his cheek. I wonder if this was a final appeal to Judas. What was done, but did Jesus hope in some way that his betrayer would remember the friendship they once had? The many happy hours of loving counsel Jesus would offer him and the sweetness of his care that was once so familiar. Behold the patience of Christ's love. Darkness draws near, and even through betrayal, the character of Jesus was changeless. As Jesus was arrested, his disciples fled from him. He was dragged before a Roman governor who could find no fault with him, but the crowd that had gathered were provoked, and in uproar they cried out for him to be crucified. And so it was. He was taken away by Roman soldiers who twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. In the Bible, we read that they stripped him and mocked him, spat on him, and struck his face with a staff again and again, until his form was marred beyond human likeness, and his appearance was disfigured beyond that of any man. On shoulders wet with blood, he carried his cross, and they led him to a hill called Calvary. This was the site of his execution. At some point during his ascent, Jesus fell to the ground, exhausted beneath the heavy weight of a cross he had no strength to bear. And realizing the frailty of his condition, his persecutors saw he could go no further, and so they made a bystander carry his cross. Scoffs and taunts of groundless hate followed Jesus with every step, but no murmur of complaint left his mouth. No grumble or moan was heard as onlookers scorned and threw insult after insult upon him. Allow yourself to marvel at the meekness and humility of Jesus. And they arrived at Calvary. At this point, the soldiers were perhaps used to a wrestle with criminals in their last-ditched efforts to escape the clutches of a most vicious death. But to Jesus, no restraint was applied, nor was it needed. As the cross was placed on the ground and his body positioned over it, he made no struggle. And as they hammered nails through his hands and feet, though he winced with each blow, he did not resist. And they lifted that cross, standing it upright in position, and there Jesus hung until he breathed his last. Darkness draws near, and even as he faced the brutality of the cross, the character of Jesus was changeless. None of this is easy to hear, but that's kind of the point. This points to something deeper. Even at the height of his suffering, Jesus was most concerned with a humanity that was broken and lost. And while he was on the cross, he spoke to God and said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." I wonder if he was thinking of his disciples that abandoned him and left him to suffer all alone. Perhaps he was thinking of the soldiers that scourged and flogged until his body was reduced to something unrecognizable. Was he thinking of the onlookers that bellowed their loathe as he labored towards Calvary under the heaviest burden? And even of the Roman soldier that with hammer and spikes affixed him to a cross? To forgive without reserve in such a moment is beyond human comprehension. It's beyond what our human nature can immediately grasp. But this is Jesus. Today, darkness draws near, and still he is changeless. When God created humanity, he did so with the intention that we would be in perfect relationship with him. But humanity turned away from this God of love to satisfy its own selfish desires, its own greed and pride. And so this disconnect took place where we could no longer walk with God in the fullness of the relationship he intended. And we became desperately in need of a Savior, Jesus. And with his blood, the penalty for our sin was paid. In the midst of the deepest darkness, no facet of his nature could be compromised. To treachery, he gave pity and kindness. To cries of scorn, he showed humility and meekness. And on the cross, through searing pain, he prayed mercy over those that offered him none. It doesn't satisfy then that Jesus was merely a good man. Surely his flawlessness is worth your attention. The centurion realized it, that this truly was a righteous man. What will be your response?